orphanage stood in silence, a cathedral of glass and cold light. Within its walls, children of translucent beauty slept in their fragile shells, hearts that did not beat, eyes that did not dream. Elara moved among them like a ghost of compassion, her reflection fractured in every polished surface. Yet in the stillness, something stirred, a faint glow beneath one child's ribs, pulsing softly, impossibly alive. It was a secret heartbeat, delicate and defiant, whispering of hope in a world built on control. As Elara reached toward that fragile light, she felt destiny fracture and begin to breathe. The carnival lights flickered faintly in the distance, stubbornly clinging to the night like a dying ember refusing to be extinguished. I stood on the edges of town, the cold morning air biting through my thin jacket, my breath a visible ghost dissolving into the chill. The grotesque glow of the carnival stretched out before me, an unyielding, unnatural presence that no sunrise could fully erase. I wanted to believe I was free. I had run from the labyrinth of twisted mirrors, the laughter that gnawed at my bones, the hunger that devoured hope itself. But standing there, with the first pale light brushing the cracked pavement, I felt the weight of the carnival's shadow still pressing down on my chest. The town was quiet, but not peaceful. It carried the residue of the carnival's unending feast. The missing faces, the whispered rumors, the fading smiles of those who had once wandered into its grasp. My own reflection caught in a darkened window, fractured and uncertain, mirrored the fractured pieces of my soul. I traced a finger along the cold glass, feeling the subtle tremor beneath my skin, the echo of something ancient and insatiable lurking just beyond the veil of reality. Back in my room, the carnival posters on the wall seemed to warp and shift when I wasn't looking. The colors bled, the clown's smiles twisted into grimaces of despair. I sat on the edge of my bed, my eyes locked on the cracked mirror beside the dresser. My face stared back at me, pale and gaunt, eyes wide but wary. The nightmare had marked me, not just on my skin but deep inside, where the carnival's hunger still gnawed. I remembered Mara's warning, the way her eyes held both resignation and fierce determination. I saw her face in flickering carnival mirrors, always just out of reach, her voice a whisper carried on the wind. Beware the hunger that never sleeps. The carnival was not gone, it never truly left. It lingered in the shadows of the town, in the silence between heartbeats, in the laughter that echoed faintly at the edge of hearing. Mr. Grin's wide, unnerving smile haunted the corners of my vision, and the twins stood silent sentinels in the fog, their painted faces frozen in sinister grins. I wanted to scream, to warn the others, but the words caught in my throat. My mother didn't believe me. The townsfolk went about their days, eyes glazed with complacency or fear. The carnival's hunger was a cycle, a never-ending feast that fed on innocence, on hope, on the very souls of those drawn into its spectacle. And I was left standing beneath the carnival lights, caught between relief and terror, between escape and entrapment. The nightmare was not over. It was only beginning anew. As dusk began to fall once more, the carnival's lights sputtered to life, flickering like a heartbeat in the dark. The music swelled, distant and haunting, and I could feel the hunger stirring again, a living pulse beneath the carnival's gleaming surface, waiting for the next soul to be lured into its grasp. I turned away, but the laughter followed me, echoing through the night, a reminder that beneath the carnival lights, some horrors never fade. They wait, and they hunger. Elara moved silently through the sterile halls of the orphanage, her footsteps muffled by the thick, seamless flooring that reflected the harsh overhead lights like a fractured mirror. The air was cool, sterile, almost antiseptic in its precision, and the faint hum of machinery pulsed through the walls, a constant reminder of the clinical nature of this place. Yet amid this cold efficiency, a fragile beauty lingered, one that Elara found herself drawn to with a mixture of reverence and unease. In the center of the ward, Lumen sat quietly on a smooth, white bench, the faint glow beneath the child's translucent ribs pulsing softly with a steady heartbeat. Elara's sharp eyes, reflective and keen, studied the subtle rise and fall of Lumen's fragile chest. The child's glass body shimmered faintly under the artificial light, each delicate curve and contour catching and bending the beams, casting fractured rainbows across the polished floors. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as they hovered just above Lumen's cool surface. Unlike the other glass children, whose stillness often bordered on statuesque, Lumen radiated a quiet vitality that was impossible to ignore. Elara's heart clenched at the uniqueness of this fragile being, part artificial, part achingly real, whose existence challenged everything she thought she knew. As she withdrew her hand, Elara's mind drifted back to her former life, one shadowed by ethical conflicts and agonizing decisions. She had been a scientist once, a creator of artificial life, but the sterile laboratories and clinical detachment had weighed heavily on her conscience. The project she had helped develop was meant to push the boundaries of science, to redefine what life could be, but at what cost. Her departure had been abrupt, driven by a gnawing sense of guilt and a refusal to become complicit in what she increasingly saw as an exploitation of innocence. Yet here she was, drawn back into the heart of the orphanage, now as a caretaker rather than a scientist, standing guard over these fragile beings crafted from glass and light. The other children moved with an eerie grace, their translucent forms shimmering and shifting in the dim corridors. They seemed to exist in a world apart, caught between reality and illusion. Their behaviors were enigmatic, sometimes playful, sometimes distant, as if they were echoes of something lost or not yet understood. Elara watched as one child caught a beam of light, fracturing it into a cascade of dancing prisms that flickered across the walls like ghostly whispers. She felt a pang of sorrow and hope entwined, a recognition of innocence at risk, and a desperate yearning to shield it. The motif of reflection haunted her thoughts. The glass was not just a physical barrier, but a metaphor for identity, vulnerability, and the fragile line between artifice and life. In the stillness of the ward, Elara found herself gazing into a pane of glass, catching her own reflection fractured and multiplied. 1,000 Elaras staring back with mirrored eyes filled with doubt and determination. Later, in the quiet sanctuary of her small office, Elara confided in Myra, her assistant and confidant. Myra's soft features and warm presence were a balm against the coldness of the orphanage. They spoke in hushed tones, the distant drone of the orphanage's machinery underscoring their conversation. "Lumen is different," Elara whispered, voice barely audible. "There's something real beneath the glass, a heartbeat." "A life," Myra nodded, her eyes reflecting concern and empathy. "We have to be careful. The others don't understand, but I believe you." Their alliance was fragile, but Elara moved silently through the sterile halls of the orphanage, her footsteps muffled by the thick, seamless flooring that reflected the harsh overhead lights like a fractured mirror. The air was cool, sterile, almost antiseptic in its precision, and the faint hum of machinery pulsed through the walls, a constant reminder of the clinical nature of this place. Yet amid this cold efficiency, a fragile beauty lingered, one that Elara found herself drawn to with a mixture of reverence and unease. In the center of the ward, Lumen sat quietly on a smooth, white bench, the faint glow beneath the child's translucent ribs pulsing softly with a steady heartbeat. Elara's sharp eyes, reflective and keen, studied the subtle rise and fall of Lumen's fragile chest. The child's glass body shimmered faintly under the artificial light, each delicate curve and contour catching and bending the beams, casting fractured rainbows across the polished floors. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as they hovered just above Lumen's cool surface. Unlike the other glass children, whose stillness often bordered on statuesque, Lumen radiated a quiet vitality that was. Elara moved quietly through the cold corridors of the orphanage, the soft echo of her footsteps swallowed by the sterile white walls that stretched endlessly around her. The light overhead flickered faintly, casting fractured reflections in the smooth glass surfaces that lined the halls. Each pane was not merely a window, but a silent witness to the fragile lives contained within. The glass children, with their translucent limbs and delicate forms, moved with an eerie grace, their faint pulses of light flickering like fragile stars in a dark sky. She paused outside the common room, watching as the children shifted subtly, their glass bodies whispering secrets in shimmering patterns. There was something different tonight, something unspoken yet palpable in the air. Elara's sharp eyes caught the faintest quiver in Lumen's form as the child reached out, fingers trembling, to touch another child. The reflections danced between them, light bending and breaking in ways that stirred a strange mixture of awe and dread in her heart. Later, in the dim sanctuary of the caretaker's break room, Elara sat across from Myra. The room was cloaked in shadows, the harsh brightness of the orphanage replaced by a muted warmth. Myra's presence was a balm, her soft features etched with concern as Elara spoke in hushed tones. "There's more to this place than they told us," Elara confessed, voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen things, behaviors, patterns that don't fit with the original designs. The children, they're changing." Myra reached out, placing a steady hand over Elara's trembling fingers. "We'll face it together," she said firmly. "But we must be careful. They're watching, and Director Voss's reach is long." The weight of those words settled heavily on Elara's shoulders. Outside the room, the orphanage continued its cold rhythm, but beneath the surface, a storm was gathering. Meanwhile, Jack slipped through shadowed corridors, his movements swift and silent. His eyes darted nervously as he approached the security hub, fingers already working the controls with practiced ease. The sterile hum of machinery was a constant reminder of the walls closing in around them. He downloaded encrypted files, exposing the sinister underpinnings of the Glass Children project, files that, if revealed, could unravel the carefully constructed facade of control. But with each risk he took, the danger grew. Security protocols tightened, and the presence of Director Voss's agents loomed ever nearer. Jax knew the stakes. Failure meant not only his own end, but the destruction of the fragile lives he had come to cherish. Back in the children's quarters, the Glass Children's surreal behaviors escalated. Their bodies flickered with shifting light, casting kaleidoscopic patterns over the walls. Their movements were fluid, almost alien, like whispers of a secret language spoken through the gleam of shattered reflections. Elara watched, heart clenched, as innocence and vulnerability seemed to merge with something otherworldly. Her protective instincts flared. The orphanage, once a place of quiet care, was becoming a battleground of shadows and secrets. And at its heart lay the fragile truth that could shatter everything. As the day waned, Elara found herself at the observation window, gazing out at the sterile landscape beyond. The cold light fractured across her face, her reflection intertwining with the fragile outlines of the Glass Children behind her. In that fractured reflection, she saw herself anew, a guardian caught between hope and despair, strength and vulnerability. The whispers in the glass were growing louder, and Elara knew the fragile silence could break at any moment. She pressed her palm against the cool surface of the window, feeling the faint tremor beneath, a silent promise that she would not let the children shatter. Not while she still breathed. Outside, the first shadows of night crept toward the orphanage, carrying with them the threat of revelation and ruin. Inside, fragile hearts beat quietly, waiting for a protector to rise. And Elara was ready to answer the call. The fragile sanctuary was no longer safe. The battle for innocence had begun. The Glass Children shimmered in the fading light, their whispers growing into a chorus of fragile defiance. And as the shadows lengthened, Elara steeled herself for the storm to come, knowing that every choice, every whispered secret could change everything. The nursery was hushed, bathed in the pale, clinical light that filtered through the high, frost-coated windows. Rows of Glass Children lay in their translucent cradles, their delicate forms glowing faintly in the sterile environment. Elara moved softly through the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick mats placed carefully beneath her feet to prevent any accidental disturbance. Her sharp eyes, reflective like shards of glass themselves, scanned the fragile figures with a mixture of reverence and unease. Her gaze settled on Lumen, the child who had come to occupy more than just a corner of her mind. Unlike the others, who seemed little more than exquisite sculptures, Lumen bore a faint, pulsing glow beneath the ribs, an erratic heartbeat that whispered of something profoundly alive. Elara knelt beside the cradle, her breath held as the child's slender fingers twitched, reaching outward in slow, tentative movements. The glass fingers caught the sterile light, fracturing it into a kaleidoscope of shimmering reflections that danced along the white walls. "You're different," Elara whispered, voice barely audible over the soft hum of the orphanage's life support systems. "Not just fragile, alive." Lumen's eyes, deep pools of translucent blue, met hers briefly, a flicker of curiosity sparking within. The silent communication between them was electric, a fragile thread weaving connection through the cold space. Elara's heart clenched with a bittersweet ache. She had cared for many glass children before, but none had stirred such fierce protectiveness. The child was a paradox, so vulnerable, yet pulsing with an undeniable vitality. She rose slowly, the weight of responsibility pressing down like the sterile air around her. Outside the nursery, the orphanage's corridors gleamed with cold efficiency, the spotless surfaces reflecting every echo and shadow. Elara's reflection caught her own sharp eyes, mirrors to the fractured pieces of her soul. For so long, she had maintained a careful distance, a shield forged from her past as a scientist embroiled in ethical conflicts that had driven her from the project. But now that shield felt brittle, cracking under the force of her growing empathy. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. Myra stepped inside, her presence warm and steady like a hearth in the cold place. Her soft features and worn clothing contrasted with the clinical surroundings, a reminder of the humanity Elara clung to. "How is she?" Myra asked quietly, nodding toward Lumen's cradle. Elara hesitated, then nodded. "More alive than the others, it's unsettling and wonderful all at once." Myra approached, her eyes gentle but concerned. "You're letting yourself care, Elara. That's dangerous here." A shadow passed over Elara's face. "I know. But how can I not? She's not just glass, she's a heart beating beneath it all." Their conversation was cut short by the distant, sharp clatter of footsteps echoing down the hallway. Elara's gaze snapped to the door's reflective glass pane, catching the faint silhouette of an austere figure framed against the stark light, the unmistakable presence of Director Voss. Voss's cold eyes swept the corridor, calculating and merciless. Behind him, security lead Royce and several agents followed, their movements precise and threatening. Their steps resonated like a ticking clock, a reminder that time and control were closing in. Elara's chest tightened. The director's obsession with power and control had become an oppressive force within the orphanage's walls. His agents' increasing presence was a suffocating shadow that threatened to crush the fragile sanctuary she had tried so hard to protect. Later, in the caretaker's quarters, Elara sat alone. The room was dim, shadows pooling in the corners like spilled ink. Her eyes, reflective and sharp, caught shards of the glass children's shapes flickering through the window, a distorted reflection of herself and the fragile lives she guarded. She felt the weight of isolation pressing down, the loneliness that had shaped her for years. Yet beneath that, a stirring, a tentative embrace of vulnerability. Lumen had cracked open something within her, a longing to connect, to protect not just the fragile vessels, but the living pulse beneath. Myra's voice broke through the silence when she returned with a tray of simple food. "You can't fight this alone," she said softly. "We need each other now more than ever." Elara nodded, swallowing the lump of fear in her throat. "I know. But the fragility of it all, it scares me." "Fragility is not weakness," Myra replied, her eyes steady. "It's the space where strength can grow." Outside, the orphanage's mechanical heartbeat thrummed steadily, but within its walls, the fragile balance between hope and dread had begun to tilt. Elara's bond with Lumen deepened, a beacon in the encroaching shadows. Yet, as Director Voss's grip tightened, the fragile sanctuary threatened to shatter. At night, when the children's soft breathing and the occasional faint pulse from Lumen's glowing heart filled the air, Elara found herself drawn back to the nursery. She stood silently, watching the glass children shimmer in the dim light, their beauty and vulnerability entwined like threads of a delicate tapestry. Her fingers hovered over Lumen's cradle, trembling slightly before resting gently on the smooth surface. "I will protect you," she vowed, voice barely more than a breath, "no matter what it takes." But even as she made that promise, the cold eyes of Director Voss watched from the shadows beyond the glass panes, his intentions as unyielding as the fragile walls that enclosed them all. The orphanage was no longer just a place of care. It was a battleground where fragility and power collided, where the heart beneath the glass could ignite a revolution or be crushed beneath the weight of control. And Elara stood at the center, torn between the shards of her past and the fragile hope she now carried. As dawn crept over the horizon, casting long reflections through the windows, the fragile children slept on, unaware of the storm gathering around them. Elara's resolve hardened like tempered glass, ready to face the shadows and protect the fragile light flickering within Lumen's chest. The fragile balance held for now. Elara sat in the dim corner of the nursery, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool surface of a glass child's arm. The translucent figure sat motionless, its faintly glowing veins pulsing beneath a fragile shell. The air hummed softly with the sterile chill that permeated every room of the orphanage, a place where light seemed to fracture endlessly, bouncing off glass and steel with dispassionate clarity. Outside the window, the cold sky pressed against the horizon, a silent reminder of the world beyond these walls. The stillness was broken by a quiet knock at the heavy steel door. Elara's sharp eyes flicked toward the sound, and she rose carefully, mindful not to startle the children who seemed to shimmer with faint reflections of her movement. Myra stepped in, her warm presence a balm against the clinical austerity of the space. "Jax is here," Myra whispered, glancing nervously toward the corridor. Elara nodded, her heart tightening. The technician's rebellious spirit had become an unexpected ally in this place of fragile secrets. The door opened just enough to reveal Jax's disheveled figure, quick eyes scanning before settling on Elara. "I don't have much time," Jax said hurriedly, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. He pulled a small data chip from his pocket, pressing it into Elara's hand with trembling fingers. "This is what they're really planning. The corporation, they don't see these children as anything but assets, perfect vessels for control." Elara's breath caught. The cold dread she'd tried to suppress now roared beneath her skin. "How deep does it go?" Jax's eyes darkened. "Beyond anything you could imagine. They want to weaponize the glass children, use them in ways that, it's monstrous. Lumen is the key to it all. Lumen. The child with the real beating heart beneath the fragile exterior. The anomaly that had become Elara's secret, her burden." Myra moved closer, placing a comforting hand on Elara's shoulder. "We have to be careful. The children are more vulnerable than ever." Elara's gaze drifted toward the nursery's center, where the glass children sat in silent clusters. Their forms caught the weak light and fractured it into dancing patterns on the walls. Yet something was different. Their movements were less mechanical now, more fluid, almost alive in a way that unsettled the sterile order of the orphanage. A soft murmur rippled through the room, a sound like whispered secrets or distant echoes. The children's eyes, crystalline and unblinking, flickered with strange vitality. One reached out, delicate fingers tracing patterns on a pane of glass, scattering light into shimmering shards that played across the ceiling. "They're changing," Elara whispered, "not just physically, but something deeper." Myra nodded, her expression grave. "The more they sense the danger, the more their innocence is threatened." A sudden alarm shattered the fragile calm. The piercing sound echoed through the sterile halls, reverberating against polished steel and glass. The children froze, their bodies trembling with an eerie iridescence that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of their hidden fears. Elara's heart pounded. "We need to prepare." In the shadows beyond the nursery, the sterile walls seemed to close in, the light fracturing into endless reflections. Elara caught her own image in a nearby pane, tall, pale, her sharp eyes mirroring the fragile forms she vowed to protect. The weight of the revelation pressed down, a fracture in the silence that had held the orphanage captive. "This place," she murmured, "is no longer safe." Jax's voice was low but resolute. "We fight or we lose everything." Elara inhaled deeply, the cold air filling her lungs. The path ahead was uncertain, shadowed by danger and despair. Yet within the fragile hearts beating beneath glass, she found a spark of desperate hope, a fragile light in the encroaching darkness. And she would guard it with everything she had. Outside the nursery, the orphanage's corridors stretched endlessly, sterile and unyielding. Yet beneath the surface, fractures had begun to form, not just in glass, but in trust, in silence, and in the fragile bonds that held this place together. Elara knew the coming days would test every ounce of her courage and compassion. The quiet rebellion of the children, the whispered secrets shared in shadowed halls, and the looming threat of those who sought to exploit innocence all converged in a delicate dance. The orphanage was a cage, but in its heart, a fragile resistance flickered to life, one that might shatter the cold order forever. Elara stood at the threshold of this new reality, her reflections fractured yet clear. The children depended on her. Lumen, with the beating heart hidden beneath translucent ribs, was the key to everything. She would protect them, even if it meant breaking the silence, even if it meant shattering the fragile peace they clung to. Because sometimes, the greatest strength was born in the fractures of silence. The alarm continued to echo faintly, a reminder that the true battle had only just begun. As night deepened, the glass children gathered in their spaces, their fragile forms catching the dim light in mesmerizing patterns. Elara and Myra moved among them quietly, their hands gentle, their voices soft. The surreal behavior of the children, the way they seemed to reflect and refract light, almost communicating in silence, was both beautiful and terrifying. Elara's mind raced with the information Jax had provided. She pieced together the corporate plans, the exploitation, the cold strategies that viewed these children not as beings but as commodities. Her own past as a scientist haunted her. Had she unknowingly helped birth this nightmare? The ethical conflicts, once distant and theoretical, now pressed against her soul like shards of broken glass. Myra, ever the nurturer, whispered reassurances. "We will keep them safe." Together, Elara's eyes glistened, mirroring the fragile forms around her. Yes, together. But outside, in the shadows beyond the orphanage, the forces of control were tightening their grip. And the fractures in silence were beginning to widen into cracks that threatened to consume them all. The fragile balance between innocence and exploitation, between hope and despair, trembled on the edge of breaking. And Elara knew there would be no turning back now. The nursery was a chamber bathed in pale, clinical light, its sterile surfaces gleaming with the cold precision of technology. Rows of glass children lay in their translucent cribs, their delicate forms shimmering faintly under the artificial glow. Elara stood silently by the threshold, her sharp eyes, reflective and searching, fixed on the child in the center. This was Lumen, the anomaly, the fragile bearer of a secret that shattered the orphanage's imposed order. A gentle stillness settled over the room, broken only by the faint hum of the climate regulators and the subtle, almost imperceptible pulse emanating from beneath Lumen's ribs. Elara's breath caught as she leaned a little closer. There, beneath the fragile lattice of glass, a faint glow pulsed rhythmically, like a beacon of life in a sea of artifice. Her heart stirred, a mixture of awe and dread tightening her chest. Lumen's eyes, deep pools of translucent clarity, flickered with a sudden spark of vitality. Tentatively, the child extended a trembling hand towards the nearest glass child, a smaller figure whose body gleamed like spun crystal. Their fingertips brushed, and the contact produced a delicate chime, soft, crystalline, and hauntingly beautiful. Light fractured and scattered, casting prismatic shards that danced across the nursery walls. Elara felt a shiver run down her spine. This was no mere reflection or trick of light. The pulse beneath Lumen's ribs was real, its beating heart setting off a cascade of shimmering reflections that seemed to breathe life into the room. The glass children, usually so still and silent, responded subtly, their forms flickering as though stirred by a gentle breeze. The fragile flames of their existence wavered, casting a kaleidoscope of colors that softened the orphanage's sterile silence. From behind Elara, a soft voice whispered, Myra stepped closer, her warm eyes mirroring the spectrum of light. "It's more than we imagined," she said quietly, reaching out to touch Elara's arm. "He's a sign. A hope." Elara turned, meeting Myra's gaze. The assistant caretaker's presence was a balm to the cold loneliness that often gripped her. "But what does it mean?" Elara murmured, her voice thick with uncertainty. "If Lumen's heart is real, what does that say about the children? About this place?" Myra sighed, her breath a gentle exhale in the still air. "It means the line between life and artifice is thinner than we thought. That maybe there's more to protect than glass and light." The revelation stirred something deep within Elara, a tumult of emotions she had long kept buried. The orphanage was no longer just a sterile sanctuary. It was a crucible of ethical conflict, a battleground between control and compassion. The fragile bodies of the glass children symbolized innocence endangered by cold authority, but Lumen embodied something greater: defiance, hope, the pulse of genuine life. As Lumen's hand lingered on the glass surface of the nearest child, reflections cascaded around them like ethereal wings, enveloping the room in a shimmering embrace. The moment felt suspended in time, a fragile heartbeat in the vast machinery of the orphanage. Elara stepped forward, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch Lumen's glowing chest. The warmth beneath the glass was faint but undeniable, a stark contrast to the coldness that had pervaded her world. She whispered softly, almost a prayer, "You are not alone." The pulse quickened, as if responding to her words. In that instant, the boundaries between artificial and living blurred, revealing a fragile truth: that even in a world built on control and cold precision, life could bloom unexpectedly, fragile yet fierce. The nursery seemed to breathe with renewed life. The glass children shifted, their delicate forms reflecting the myriad colors of hope and fear intertwined. Elara's resolve hardened. She would protect this fragile heartbeat, this flicker of genuine life, no matter the cost. Outside, the orphanage's cold halls awaited her decision, shadows lengthening as secrets deepened. But within the nursery, amidst the fractured light and delicate forms, a new pulse echoed, the heart's pulse of rebellion, resilience, and the fragile promise of tomorrow. And as Elara stood guarding the fragile flame of Lumen's life, she knew the path ahead would be perilous. Yet, in the haunting melancholy mingled with desperate hope, she found a strength she had never known before. The heart's pulse was more than a secret. It was a call to action, a beacon in the darkness, a fragile shining truth that could not be silenced. And so, the story of the glass children, of innocence and reflection, of fragility and resilience, took a new and uncertain turn, the fragile heartbeat at its core beating steadily into the unknown. The sterile corridor of the orphanage hummed with the low, incessant drone of air circulation and distant mechanical whirs. Elara stood silently by the observation window, her sharp, reflective eyes tracing the movements of the glass children within the ward. They moved with a fragile grace, their translucent limbs catching the cold fluorescent light, casting fractured reflections on the polished floor. The air was thin with a clinical chill, and in that moment, Elara felt the weight of the orphanage's demands pressing down on her. Across the room, caretaker Dane paced steadily. His posture was rigid, his movements precise and unyielding, like the clockwork mechanisms embedded deep within the orphanage's design. He called the children to order with a flat voice, his words void of warmth or hesitation. "Line up for the daily maintenance inspection," he instructed, his tone more command than request. The glass children obeyed, their bodies shimmering softly as they moved into formation. There was a mechanical rhythm to their obedience, a quiet surrender to the protocols that dictated their existence. Elara's gaze softened as she watched Lumen step hesitantly to the front, his faintly glowing heart pulsing beneath the fragile surface. She knelt beside him, careful not to startle the delicate child. Her breath misted the glass as she whispered, "You're safe here, Lumen. I won't let anything happen to you." Nearby, Dane's eyes flickered toward Elara, unreadable and cold. "Caretaker Elara," he said sharply, "your leniency endangers the order we must maintain. The children require discipline, not indulgence." Elara met his gaze steadily, her voice firm but gentle. "They're not machines, Dane. They feel even if their bodies are fragile. We owe them more than just rules." Before Dane could respond, the heavy metallic clatter of boots echoed down the hall. Security lead Royce appeared, his imposing figure casting a long shadow. Clad in dark tactical gear, his cold eyes swept the ward with a calculating scrutiny. The glass children recoiled subtly, their delicate forms trembling with apprehension. Royce's voice was low and uncompromising as he addressed the caretakers. "Director Voss has ordered heightened security measures. No deviations from protocol will be tolerated." Elara's heart clenched. The orphanage's walls seemed to tighten around her, the sterile coldness seeping into her bones. She glanced at Lumen, whose faint pulses beat steadily beneath his fragile ribs. "We must protect them," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Later, in the dim light of a small break room, Elara found herself alone with Dane. The tension between them was palpable, a quiet storm brewing beneath polite facades. "Your compassion blinds you," Dane said quietly but firmly. "The children's fragility is a liability. Strict adherence to rules is the only way to ensure their survival." Elara shook her head, frustration lacing her voice. "Survival without dignity is no life at all. They deserve more than to be caged by fear and control." Dane's expression hardened. "You risk everything with your softness. Remember, Director Voss's orders are clear." Elara's eyes darkened with resolve. "Then I'll find a way to protect them, even if I have to stand against the entire orphanage." The clash of philosophies hung in the air, a fragile balance teetering on the edge of fracture. Outside, Royce's patrol continued relentlessly, a grim reminder of the forces arrayed against Elara's tender guardianship. As the day faded, Elara returned to the ward, her fingers brushing lightly over Lumen's cool glass arm. The child's faint pulse echoed in her mind, a beacon of hope amid the encroaching shadows. She understood now more than ever that beneath the surface of this cold, clinical world, a storm was gathering, one that would test the limits of fragility, resilience, and the very meaning of life itself. The chapter closed with Elara's whispered vow lingering in the stale air. "I will protect you, no matter the cost." The orphanage slept uneasily, but for Elara, the night was alive with the quiet promise of resistance and the haunting question of what it truly meant to be human in a world built on glass. The cold glow of the holographic screens splintered across the maintenance room's metallic surfaces, casting fractured light that danced as if hesitant to fully illuminate the secrets held within. Elara crouched beside a console, her fingers trembling slightly as she navigated encrypted folders, each file a shard of the hidden truth she sought. Beside her, Jax's disheveled frame leaned into the glow, his quick eyes darting over streams of data with the practiced urgency of someone who had once been part of this world, but now stood defiantly against it. "Here," Jax whispered, voice low and urgent, "this is what they're hiding, the real purpose behind the glass children. It's not just about care or preservation. It's control, commodification. They want to weaponize innocence." Elara's breath hitched. The sterile walls of the orphanage suddenly felt suffocating, the weight of cold authority pressing down like an invisible hand. Her reflective eyes caught the shards of light bouncing off the glass children's pods nearby, each child a delicate prism of translucent fragility, innocence trapped and shaped by unseen hands. "They're exploiting them," she murmured, "using them as tools, not as lives." Jax nodded grimly. "And Lumen, that child is the key, the anomaly they fear but also want to control." Outside the maintenance room, the soft footsteps echoed faintly. Myra moved quietly through the corridors, her presence a balm against the rising storm. In the nursery, she knelt beside a trembling glass child, her voice a gentle tide of warmth amidst the sterile chill. The child's translucent form flickered under the dim corridor lights, casting fleeting reflections like tiny stars caught in fragile glass. "Shh," Myra whispered, her hand hovering delicately above the child's fragile shoulder, careful not to disturb the brittle shell. "You're safe, we're here." The child's eyes, pools of shimmering translucence, met Myra's with a fragile trust, a brief flicker of hope rekindling in the dimness. Back in the shadowed maintenance room, Elara's gaze shifted to a towering reflective panel that divided the space, its surface a mirror that fractured her image into countless shards. She saw herself multiplied, each reflection a shard of vulnerability and strength intertwined, a silent echo of the children she tended. The motif of reflection, always present, now felt like a revelation. She was part of them, fragile yet unyielding. "I can't let them win," Elara spoke softly, more to herself than to Jax. "They don't understand what it means to be alive, even if that life is fragile." Jax reached out, gripping her shoulder with rough but steady hands. "Then we fight, together." The distant hum of the orphanage's ventilation system was punctuated by faint, almost ghostly whispers, the surreal murmurs of the glass children, their behaviors growing ever more otherworldly, as if sensing the encroaching danger. Elara felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on her shoulders, but within it, a flicker of fierce determination. She glanced down at her hands, the soft skin contrasting with the brittle glass she so carefully protected. The lines between artificial creation and genuine life blurred more each day, and the truth they uncovered was a jagged fracture threatening to shatter their fragile sanctuary. "We need to warn Myra," Elara said, eyes reflecting the glow of the screens. "The children need to be ready." Jax nodded, fingers already moving to secure the data and prepare for what was to come. As they slipped from the maintenance room, the orphanage around them seemed to hold its breath, its cold walls reflecting not just light, but the mounting peril. In that moment, Elara felt the fragile heartbeat of hope beneath the glass, a pulse she would guard with every fiber of her being. The shards of truth had been uncovered, but the battle for innocence was just beginning. And in the fractured reflections of glass and soul, Elara understood. To protect life's fragile flame, she must first confront the darkness within and beyond. The orphanage's silence was no longer empty. It was charged with the promise of resistance, the trembling echo of lives determined not to break. As Elara and Jax vanished down the sterile corridors, the children's whispers grew louder, weaving a haunting melody of fragile hope that defied the cold grip of control. Outside, beyond the walls of glass and steel, shadows stirred. The fight for the heart of the orphanage had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. The sterile silence of the orphanage was shattered by the abrupt wail of alarms, a piercing sound that cut through the cold air like a jagged shard of glass. Elara's sharp, reflective eyes snapped open as the emergency lights bathed the hallways in a fractured blue glow, casting prismatic shards of light against the translucent bodies of the glass children. Somewhere deep in the building, the unmistakable crunch of heavy boots echoed, an intrusion into this fragile sanctuary. Her heart tightened, a hollow ache swelling within her chest. She had sensed the creeping shadow of control tightening its grip, but this was an invasion. Director Voss's agents were here. The cold tendrils of his ambition had breached the walls she had vowed to protect. "Myra," Elara whispered urgently, her voice barely audible over the wailing alarms. "The children, prepare them. We don't have much time." Myra's warm eyes met hers, steady and reassuring. "I'll keep them calm," she promised, moving swiftly to the nearest cluster of glass children. Their translucent forms shimmered, delicate and eerie, reflections dancing in their fragile surfaces. The children, usually so silent and still, now trembled with a quiet fear that the caretakers both shared and fought against. Elara's gaze flicked toward the central chamber where Lumen lay. The child's glass body pulsed faintly, the soft glow of a real beating heart visible beneath the fragile ribs, a secret she had vowed to guard with her life. She moved quickly, her slender frame weaving through the corridors as the sound of boots grew louder, the agents' voices sharp and commanding. She reached Lumen's side just as a harsh voice barked orders nearby. "Secure the child, no mistakes." Elara crouched beside Lumen, her hands trembling but determined. She traced gentle, protective lines over the child's translucent skin, feeling the faint warmth beneath. "You're safe with me," she whispered, more to steady herself than the silent child. Outside, Jax moved like a shadow, his disheveled figure slipping through security checkpoints with practiced ease. He disabled cameras and electronic locks, his quick fingers dancing over consoles, each action a small rebellion against the corporate machine. His eyes darted anxiously, reflecting the flickering lights, as he whispered warnings to Myra, who balanced her nurturing warmth with a steel resolve. "They're coming through the east wing," Jax hissed into a comlink. "We have to hold the line." Myra nodded, her presence a calming anchor amid the swelling panic. She gathered the children, speaking softly, her voice a balm against the terror. "Stay close, little ones. We'll get through this together." The sterile halls, once a place of cold order, now felt alive with tension, every shadow a potential threat. Elara's mind raced, the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. Director Voss's face appeared on a surveillance screen nearby, his cold eyes glinting behind reflective glass panes. The man embodied the merciless force that sought to control and exploit the fragile lives under her care. But Elara was no longer the detached scientist she had been. The breach had ignited a fierce protectiveness, a raw courage she hadn't known she possessed. With a steadying breath, she rose, eyes blazing with defiance. "We will not let them take you," she vowed, her voice resolute. "Not while I still breathe." The orphanage trembled on the precipice of chaos, the fragile line between survival and destruction thinner than ever. Yet within that fragility lay a stubborn hope, an ember of life that refused to be extinguished. As footsteps approached and shadows lengthened, Elara steeled herself for the battle to come. The breach was only the beginning, and she would fight with every shard of her being to protect the glass children who had become her world. The cold lights flickered, the alarms blared, and somewhere beneath the fragile surfaces, a heart beat fiercely, an echo of life against the dark. Outside the ward, Royce's silhouette loomed, a ruthless specter enforcing orders with merciless precision. The clash between control and compassion was imminent, and the orphanage's fragile sanctuary would never be the same. Elara's breath caught as she heard the first crash of the security breach, glass trembling beneath her touch. In that moment, she made a silent promise. No matter the cost, she would guard this fragile world with her life. For Lumen, for all the glass children, and for the fragile hope that still flickered in the shadows. The battle had begun. The sterile hum of the orphanage was punctuated by distant alarms, a cold, unyielding sound that vibrated through the metal beams and tiled floors like a warning. Elara moved quickly, her slender frame weaving through the labyrinth of narrow corridors with practiced ease. Her sharp eyes, reflective and luminous, much like the glass children she tended, scanned every corner, every flicker of shadow. The sanctuary she had painstakingly maintained was fracturing under the weight of an imminent assault, and the fragile balance was teetering dangerously. In a dimly lit room tucked away behind reinforced glass panels, Elara found Myra and Jax waiting, their faces etched with concern yet resolute determination. Myra's soft features were shadowed by worry, but the warmth in her eyes never faltered. Jax, disheveled and sharp-eyed, exuded restless energy, his fingers twitching as if eager to dismantle the very system that oppressed them. "We don't have much time," Elara whispered, her voice steady though her heart raced. "They're moving faster than we anticipated. If Royce and his men breach the east wing, the children won't stand a chance." Jax nodded, pulling up a flickering holographic map of the orphanage's layout. Lines of light traced corridors and rooms, some pulsing red where security had been compromised. "I've been working on disabling the lockdown protocols," he said, voice low but urgent. "If we can hold the main corridor, we can funnel them into a bottleneck. It won't be perfect, but it buys us precious minutes." Myra placed a comforting hand on Elara's arm. "And the children, we must keep them calm. Their reactions, their behaviors are unpredictable. The more frightened they become, the more fragile they feel." Elara's gaze drifted to the heart of the room where Lumen stood, silent and still. The child's translucent form shimmered faintly under the sterile lighting, every movement casting fractured reflections across the walls. Beneath the fragile glass ribs, a faint pulse of light throbbed rhythmically, a real, beating heart that defied the cold artifice surrounding them. Lumen's quiet vitality was a beacon of hope, but also a vulnerability that Elara felt keenly in her bones. She stepped forward, her voice soft and steady. "We protect them, all of them, but especially Lumen. The moment they realize what the child is, the moment they try to take it away," her voice broke, but her resolve did not. Jax and Myra exchanged glances, understanding the unspoken fear that gripped them all. As they prepared their defenses, the orphanage itself seemed to pulse with surreal energy. The other glass children moved in patterns that were almost ritualistic, their delicate limbs casting kaleidoscopic shards of light that danced on the walls and floors. Their movements were both mesmerizing and unsettling, a fragile ballet that echoed innocence endangered by encroaching darkness. Suddenly, a harsh clang echoed from the corridor outside. Security lead Royce appeared, his form imposing and relentless. His footsteps pounded against the floor, a grim herald of the storm to come. Elara's breath caught as Royce's cold eyes swept the room, calculating and merciless. "You cannot stop this," he said, voice like ice. "Director Voss has orders, the anomaly must be contained." Elara stepped forward, meeting his gaze. "These are children," she said quietly, but with fierce determination. "Fragile, yes, but alive and deserving of protection." Royce's expression hardened, but before he could respond, a sudden shimmer rippled through the room. Lumen reached out, fingertips grazing the glass surface of a nearby pane. The light fractured and multiplied, casting a dazzling array of colors that momentarily disarmed the tension. In that fleeting moment, Elara saw not just the vulnerability of their existence, but the resilient spark that refused to be extinguished. "We stand together," she said, voice rising with conviction. "Fragile alliances, yes, but strong enough to hold." The battle for the orphanage had begun, a desperate struggle where every choice was a risk, every moment a fragile thread in the tapestry of hope and survival. As alarms grew louder and footsteps advanced, Elara's heart beat in time with Lumen's, a steady rhythm amid the chaos, a promise that even in the face of shattering darkness, light could endure. And with that, she stepped into the fray, ready to defend the fragile lives that had become her own. The air was thick with tension as the trio moved swiftly through shadowed hallways, their whispers barely audible over the distant echoes of pursuit. Each step was measured, every breath a reminder of the stakes at hand. Elara's mind raced, calculating and recalibrating, but beneath it all lay an undercurrent of raw emotion, fear, hope, and a fierce love that defied logic. Myra's gentle presence was a balm to the group's frayed nerves. Her soft voice coaxed the glass children into calm, her hands steady as she soothed trembling limbs. The surreal spectacle of the children's glowing forms, their bodies refracting light in endless fractals, seemed both otherworldly and achingly human. Meanwhile, Jax's nimble fingers danced over control panels, hacking and rerouting power to slow the encroaching security forces. His sharp eyes caught every shift in the holographic displays, every movement of the enemy. Their alliance was fragile, born of necessity, and tempered by mutual respect and shared desperation. Yet in the face of overwhelming odds, it was enough. Outside, the relentless pounding of Royce's forces grew nearer. The cold, clinical corridors seemed to close in, the sterile walls reflecting the fractured light like a prison of glass. Elara's heart pounded in her chest, every beat a fragile promise. She thought of Lumen, of the beating heart hidden beneath translucent glass, and she knew that whatever the cost, she would protect that life and all the fragile children with every fiber of her being. The battle was not just for survival. It was for the right to hope, to dream, and to exist beyond the brittle confines of their glass cages. And in that struggle, Elara found her own strength, a fierce, unyielding light, shining through the cracks of fragility. As footsteps closed in, Elara's voice rose in a steady command, rallying her allies and the children alike. The fragile alliances they had forged would be tested, and perhaps, in the breaking, something new and beautiful would be born from the shards. The night was far from over, but the fight had begun. The corridor stretched endlessly before Elara, a narrow passage lined with cold, reflective panels that shimmered faintly under the sterile overhead lights. Each polished surface mirrored not only her pale, slender form, but the ghost-like silhouettes of glass children, fragile wraiths captured in their translucent shells. Elara's breath came slow and deliberate, fogging the glass briefly, a fleeting sign of warmth in the antiseptic chill. Her sharp eyes, so often described as reflective, now seemed less a gift and more a curse. The fractured images staring back at her fractured her own sense of self. Each reflection was a shard of memory, a whisper of failure, a hint of fear. She traced a finger along the cold surface, feeling the smoothness that could so easily betray, could so easily shatter. She thought of Lumen, the heart child, whose faint pulse was a secret beacon in this crystalline world. The child's translucent body shimmered with a subtle life force, a soft glow beneath delicate ribs. It was Lumen's vital warmth that had stirred something long dormant within her, a fragile hope that had begun to crack the walls around her heart. In the quiet nursery, Elara knelt beside Lumen's small form, mesmerized by the gentle throb beneath the glass. The rhythmic pulse filled the room like a whispered promise, an echo of true life amidst artifice. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and touched the child's cool surface. The light reflected through Lumen's fragile body, casting prismatic patterns on the sterile floor. In that moment, Elara felt the weight of her own humanity, the vulnerability, the unspoken fears, the desperate yearning to protect what was so easily lost. Yet shadows loomed beyond the quiet sanctuary. The presence of Director Voss was an omnipresent chill, a looming specter behind every decision and every locked door. His cold eyes, often glimpsed behind reflective panes, bore the ruthless ambition to control, to shape the fragile into something profitable and obedient. Elara's resolve hardened at the thought, but so did the dread that whispered of inevitable confrontation. Later, in the dim glow of the caretaker's room, Elara confided in Myra, her voice barely above a whisper. The warmth in Myra's soft features and steady gaze was a balm against the encroaching darkness. Myra's worn clothing and gentle demeanor contrasted starkly with the clinical environment, but her loyalty was unwavering. "Sometimes," Elara murmured, "I wonder if I'm enough. If protecting them is even possible when everything can break so easily." Myra reached out, her hand steady on Elara's arm. "You are more than you know. Fragility isn't weakness. It's the delicate thread that holds us to what matters." The words settled like a fragile light in Elara's chest, yet the weight of her memories pressed close. Flashbacks fluttered unbidden, failures in sterile labs, the cold calculus of scientific progress, the ethical lines she had crossed, and the ones she refused to. Her own reflection fractured again in her mind's eye, a mosaic of doubt and determination. Suddenly, the orphanage's lights flickered, plunging the halls into near darkness. The reflective surfaces shattered into scattered shards of light, dancing erratically like fractured hopes. Elara's heart quickened, matching the erratic pulses of the fragile lives she guarded. The silence was thick, broken only by the faintest sound of Lumen's heartbeat echoing in her ears. She stood firm, breath steadying, eyes scanning the shadows. The fragility of glass was a stark reminder of the fragility of life itself, yet within that vulnerability lay resilience. Elara embraced the trembling hope that surged through her veins, a fragile pulse that refused to be silenced. As the lights gradually returned, the reflections coalesced once more, but Elara's gaze held a new clarity. The line between artificial and human blurred, her own identity weaving tightly with those she vowed to protect. In this reflection, she found not weakness, but strength born from the very fragility she had feared. The chapter closed with Elara stepping forward into the dim corridor, a solitary guardian reflected 100-fold in the glass around her. Each step echoed softly, a whispered vow to defend innocence, to face the darkness ahead with courage forged in vulnerability. The haunting melancholy of the orphanage's shadows lingered, but beneath it pulsed a desperate hope, fragile yet unbreakable. And so, the fragile ward waited, holding its breath for the trials to come. The sterile glow of the laboratory lights cast long, fractured shadows across the walls. the reflections from the glass surfaces multiplying and twisting in the quiet hum of machinery. Elara sat hunched over the console, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled through fragmented data streams and encrypted files recovered from the orphanage's restricted archives. The sterile coldness of the room was at odds with the warmth blossoming in her chest, a contradiction that mirrored the growing turmoil within her. Her breath caught as her eyes settled on a series of detailed medical scans and experimental schematics labeled only as Project Lumen. The data was fragmented, but one fact shone through with crystalline clarity. Beneath the fragile, translucent exterior of the child known as Lumen lay a true, beating heart. Not a mechanical mimic, but an organic organ pulsing softly in time with a fragile, defiant life. Elara's hand instinctively rose to her chest, fingers tracing the outline of her own heart beneath the thin fabric. She had known there was something different about this child, the subtle warmth beneath the glass, the faint rhythm that sometimes seemed to echo in the silence. But seeing it here, in cold black and white detail, was like discovering a secret too precious and too dangerous to bear alone. The orphanage had always been a place of shadows and half-truths, a laboratory disguised as a sanctuary. The glass children were meant to be perfect creations, vessels for innocence sculpted from the cold clarity of science. But Lumen embodied something else entirely, a fragile bridge between artifice and life, a living heart beating defiantly against the sterile order imposed by the orphanage's creators. Elara leaned back, the chair creaking softly beneath her. Her sharp, reflective eyes, so much like the glass children she cared for, now shimmered with unshed tears. The discovery was a revelation, but also a threat. If Director Voss and his corporate overseers learned the truth, Lumen would become a prize to be seized, dissected, exploited. The child's fragile existence would be shattered in the name of power and control. A soft knock at the door pulled Elara from her spiraling thoughts. Myra stepped in quietly, her warm presence a balm against the cold sterility of the lab. Her soft gaze met Elara's, the unspoken understanding passing between them like a fragile thread of light. "You found it," Myra whispered, stepping closer, the worn fabric of her clothing brushing gently against Elara's arm. "The heart," Elara nodded, voice barely above a breath. "It's real, not just glass and circuitry. There's life inside her, a real heart." Myra's eyes softened with a mixture of awe and concern. "That changes everything." Together, they moved towards the observation chamber where Lumen rested. The child lay curled in a cradle of soft light, her translucent form glowing faintly as the heart beneath her ribs pulsed rhythmically. Elara reached out, her fingertips hovering just above the fragile surface, feeling the warmth radiating like a quiet promise. Lumen's glass fingers twitched, reaching out tentatively, the faint glow from her heart casting dancing reflections on the walls. It was a silent language, an unspoken plea for connection, for protection, for the chance to live beyond the confines of fragile glass walls. Elara's resolve hardened. No longer could she be a distant guardian, detached and cautious. The truth had shattered her emotional barriers, revealing a fierce protectiveness she had long denied. She would defend Lumen with every fiber of her being against the cold forces that sought to exploit, control, and destroy. Yet, as she stood there, the distant echo of footsteps and the tightening grip of security forces reminded her of the growing peril. The orphanage was closing in, its cold, impersonal machinery ready to crush the fragile hope nestled within its walls. Elara's mind raced with plans, secret hideaways, coded messages to Jax, alliances with Myra, every strategy to keep the heart beating, to keep the light alive. The ethical lines blurred as desperation took root. The cost of protection might demand sacrifices she was not yet ready to face. In the quiet moments before the storm, Elara allowed herself a flicker of hope. Lumen was more than a child made of glass. She was a beacon, a fragile, trembling light in a world shadowed by control and dehumanization. And Elara, once broken by her past and haunted by loss, now stood ready to fight for that light, to embrace the vulnerability that came with love and courage. The secret of the heart was out. The orphanage's cold calculations were flawed, and in that fragile imperfection lay the possibility of a future reborn. But the question lingered in the sterile air. How long could fragile hope endure in a world built to shatter it? The answers would come in the days ahead, in whispered shadows and shattered glass, in battles fought not just with steel and fire, but with the fragile strength of the human heart itself. And Elara was ready to face whatever came next. Elara stood rigid within the cold embrace of the control room, the sterile white light bouncing off the reflective glass panels that encased her. The air was heavy with an unspoken threat, the silence punctuated only by the faint hum of machines sustaining the fragile lives within the orphanage. Every step that Director Voss took as he entered was measured, deliberate, a predator entering a den where the prey was both delicate and defiant. His tall frame cast a long shadow against the polished floor, and his cold eyes fixed on Elara with an unsettling intensity. "You must understand," he began, voice low but unwavering, "this project is beyond sentiment. These children, these creations are the future. Control is necessary." Elara's gaze didn't waver. The reflective sheen in her sharp eyes mirrored not just the glass children, but the fragile hope she clung to. "Control? You mean domination," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the storm gathering within her. "They are not experiments to be exploited. They are lives, delicate, yes, but alive." A subtle tension rippled through the room like an electric charge. Behind the thick panes, the glass children lay motionless, their translucent bodies shimmering faintly under the artificial light. Among them, Lumen's faint pulse glowed beneath his ribs, a secret heartbeat that defied everything the director represented. Director Voss stepped closer, the impeccable cut of his suit a stark contrast to the vulnerability surrounding them. "Sentimentality will destroy this project. You are too attached, Elara. Your compassion blinds you." Elara's fingers tightened around the edge of the console as she swallowed the surge of fear threatening to unravel her. "And your cold pragmatism will destroy innocence. What will remain when all is broken?" He smiled, a thin, humorless curl of lips. "A new order, perfected, controlled, unbreakable." "Unbreakable," she echoed, her voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and defiance. "There is no strength in shattering what makes us human." The room seemed to darken as shadows lengthened, their shapes dancing across the glass surfaces like specters of the past and future. Myra's quiet presence behind Elara offered a faint warmth, while Jax's restless energy crackled like static, both silently bearing witness to the escalating battle of wills. Director Voss's eyes narrowed. "You cannot protect them forever. The project moves forward with or without your consent." Elara stepped forward, the fragile line between protector and rebel blurring in her mind. "Then I will do whatever it takes to stop you." His gaze hardened, final and unyielding. "So be it." The confrontation left the air thick with irrevocable change. The fragile balance that had held the orphanage together was fracturing, the first cracks appearing in the glass walls that sheltered the children. Elara's heart pounded with a mixture of dread and determination. The coming storm would tear through everything she knew, but in the depths of that chaos, a desperate hope flickered, fragile but unextinguished. As the cold light flickered overhead, Elara allowed herself a moment to glance back at Lumen, whose faint heartbeat seemed to pulse stronger in response. The line between human and artificial, between protector and destroyer, had blurred irrevocably. And with it, the fate of the glass children and the woman who vowed to save them hung in precarious balance. The room held its breath. Then, with the quiet inevitability of a shattering pain, the silence broke. The breaking point arrived with a sudden, shattering violence that tore through the sterile silence of the orphanage's corridors. Elara's breath caught as the first sound pierced the cold air, a sharp, crystalline crack that echoed like a gunshot. Her heart pounded, a rhythm fierce and relentless beneath her ribs as she glanced down the dimly lit hall. The children's translucent forms flickered in the clinical glow, their fragile bodies trembling as an ominous presence closed in. Security lead Royce and his contingent burst through the reinforced doors, their heavy boots thudding against the polished floor. The sterile calm shattered as glass splintered under the weight of desperate resistance. Elara stepped forward, her slender frame a slender shield against the encroaching darkness. "No," she whispered, voice trembling but resolute. "They belong to me." A sudden scream tore through the tumult. One of the glass children had fractured, shards glinting like scattered stars against the pale walls. Myra rushed forward, her warm hands moving swiftly to cradle the broken child's shards, her face etched with fierce determination. Elara's sharp eyes caught the flicker of Lumen's glowing heart nearby, pulsing faintly beneath the cracked surface, a fragile beacon in the storm. "Stay back," Elara's voice rose, steady despite the chaos. She moved with unexpected speed, gathering the children into protective embraces, her hands gentle but unyielding. The clash was brutal, metal against glass, cold orders shouted over the cries of frightened children. Jax darted through the chaos, sabotaging security systems with quick, deft movements, buying precious moments for Elara's fragile ward. Director Voss appeared then, a looming figure framed by the fractured glass panes of the observation deck. His eyes, sharp and cold, locked onto Elara's with a chilling intensity. "You cannot protect them," he declared, voice calm but laced with menace. "The project belongs to the corporation." Elara's jaw tightened. "Not while I breathe." The battle raged on, each moment a test of endurance and will. Glass children shattered, their broken forms reflecting the fractured hope within the orphanage's walls. Yet, amidst the ruin, Lumen's heart beat steadily, a stubborn pulse of life and defiance. Elara felt barriers within herself crumble, the careful detachment replaced by fierce protectiveness and raw emotion. Myra's soothing voice wove through the cacophony, grounding the children as they trembled in fear. Jax's quick thinking thwarted another wave of assault, his rebellious spirit igniting a spark of resistance. Even caretaker Dane, stoic and rule-bound, found himself drawn into the fight, his rigid posture softening in the face of shared peril. As the dust settled, the orphanage lay scarred and battered. Shards of glass glittered like tears across the floor. Elara knelt beside Lumen, fingers tracing the faint glow beneath the child's fragile ribs. "We survived," she murmured, hope threading through the melancholy. "We still have a chance." Yet, as the shattered silence settled, Elara knew this was only the beginning. The cost of protection was steep, and the path ahead fraught with danger and sacrifice. In the broken reflections of glass and soul, a new resolve took root, fragile, yes, but unbreakable in its depth. The orphanage, once a cold sanctuary, now echoed with the fierce pulse of resistance. Elara's journey had reached its breaking point, but from the shards, a fragile hope glimmered, promising a dawn where innocence might yet endure. Her eyes met Lumen's, the glowing heart a vivid truth beneath translucent skin. "We will face whatever comes," she vowed, voice low but unwavering. Together. Outside, the shadows deepened, but inside, a fragile light burned bright, defiant, delicate, and fiercely alive. The orphanage lay in ruins, shards of glass glittering like fallen stars across the cold, cracked floors. A heavy silence hung in the air, punctuated only by the faint, rhythmic pulse that Elara could sense as she moved cautiously through the wreckage. It was a fragile heartbeat, but it was real, and it belonged to Lumen. Elara's steps echoed softly as she made her way to the shattered atrium, where the surviving children huddled together, their translucent forms fractured and scarred, yet shimmering with a faint, surreal light. The emergency lights flickered erratically, casting long shadows that danced against the broken walls. Despite the devastation, a strange beauty lingered, fragments of innocence caught in the fragile glow of their glass bodies. Lumen stood in the center, the faint glow beneath their ribs steady and warm against the chill. Slowly, the child reached out a trembling hand, fingertips grazing the fractured edges of a broken window pane. As the light caught the glass, it fractured into a riot of colors, scattering prisms across the ruined chamber. The children watched in silent awe as the reflections wove through the air like fleeting spirits. Elara approached quietly, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. She knelt beside Lumen, her hand hovering just above the faintly glowing heart beneath the translucent surface. "You're still here," she whispered, voice trembling. The child's eyes met hers, silently luminous, filled with a curious vitality that defied their fragile form. The survivors looked to her then, their gazes fragile yet searching, as if seeking a beacon in the wreckage. It was a moment suspended in time, where despair threatened to consume, but something else, a flicker of possibility, lingered. "We're not finished," Elara said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "We still have a choice." Jax and Myra emerged from the debris nearby, their faces marked by exhaustion and grime, but their eyes alight with resolve. Together, they began clearing the shattered glass and twisted metal, working with a cautious urgency born from desperation and determination. The sound of cracking glass under their boots was a harsh reminder of the fragility that surrounded them, but it also fueled their drive to protect what remained. "We can rebuild," Myra said firmly, her voice a steady anchor amid the chaos. "We have to for them, for Lumen," Jax nodded, glancing toward the faint glow emanating from the child. "This isn't just about survival anymore, it's about what we become next." Elara watched them, feeling the weight of responsibility settle deeper into her bones. The line between artificial and living blurred further as she observed Lumen, whose presence seemed to rewrite the rules of existence within the orphanage's fractured walls. The child was no longer simply an object of care, but a catalyst for transformation, an ember of resistance against the cold, impersonal forces that sought to control and extinguish life. Later, in a moment of quiet solitude, Elara found herself before a cracked mirror hanging askew on a scorched wall. The glass was fractured, splintered into countless shards that caught the dim light and scattered it unevenly. She stared into the fragmented reflections, seeing not just her own pale, slender form and sharp, reflective eyes, but also glimpses of the glass children, broken, fragile, yet undeniably alive in their own way. Her fingers traced the jagged edges of the mirror's frame, and she thought of the journey that had brought her here, the loss, the fear, the fragile hope that had refused to die. It was a reflection of more than just physical glass. It was a metaphor for identity itself, fractured but capable of being reshaped. A sudden noise pulled her attention back to the present. Lumen's soft footsteps approached, the faint pulse beneath their ribs steady and sure. The child reached out, touching the mirror's surface gently, sending a cascade of shimmering light across the broken glass. "You're more than glass," Elara said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're life itself." Lumen's eyes met hers, bright and unwavering, as if to affirm that truth. Outside, the night pressed in, heavy with uncertainty. But within the shattered walls, a fragile flame burned, one of resilience, renewal, and the unyielding will to protect innocence in a world that had so often sought to destroy it. As dawn threatened the horizon, Elara knew their fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, she dared to believe that from the shards of ruin, something new could rise, something beautiful, something alive. And with Lumen's heartbeat lighting the way, that fragile tomorrow seemed just within reach. The echo of glass breaking still rang in Elara's ears as she moved among the survivors. Each child's translucent form bore the scars of recent violence. Cracks spidered across limbs, tiny fissures tracing delicate patterns like frozen tears. Yet, despite the damage, there was a resilience in their fragile bodies that mirrored the human spirit's enduring strength. Myra approached, carrying a small bundle of carefully wrapped shards. "We need to stabilize them," she said softly. "If we don't, the damage will worsen." Elara nodded, her mind already racing through possibilities. "We'll use the materials Jax salvaged, whatever we can find to reinforce without losing their mobility." Jax appeared at her side, face streaked with soot and sweat. "I've rigged some of the old equipment to help monitor their conditions," he said. "It's crude, but it'll give us time." "Time," Elara mused. "Time to heal and time to fight." Lumen stood nearby, watching the exchange with quiet intensity. Every so often, the child would reach out to touch another, fingertips casting fleeting rainbows of light that seemed to breathe life into the broken forms. It was a silent communion, an affirmation of connection that transcended the fragile physical shells. Elara felt a swell of emotion she could no longer suppress. "They're not just fragile," she said, voice firm. "They're alive, and as long as that heart beats, we have a chance." The survivors rallied around the renewed purpose, their collective will forging a fragile but unbreakable bond. The embers of resistance glowed faintly but steadily, illuminating the path forward amid the shadows of loss and uncertainty. Outside the orphanage's broken windows, the first light of dawn bled through the clouds, casting a pale glow over the shattered world. Inside, amidst the ruins and reflections, a new chapter was beginning, one born not of perfection, but of imperfection, not of certainty, but of hope. Elara took a deep breath, steadying herself for the challenges yet to come. She reached out once more to Lumen, their hands meeting in a delicate touch that spoke volumes. Together, they would face the unknown, guardians of a fragile tomorrow. And in that fragile tomorrow, perhaps, they would find a way to be whole again. The air was thick with dust, and the sharp scent of shattered glass, the remnants of the orphanage's once pristine halls scattered like fragile memories beneath Elara's feet. She stood motionless, her slender frame silhouetted against the fractured light filtering through the broken windows. Lumen, the heart-bearing child, moved silently among the ruins, the faint glow beneath their translucent ribs pulsing softly like a beacon against the encroaching darkness. Their delicate fingers reached out with deliberate gentleness, touching the other children, some cracked, some fractured, all still shimmering with the eerie beauty that had first drawn Elara to this place. The children's translucent bodies caught the scattered light, casting prisms of color that danced like ghosts amidst the debris. Despite the destruction, a fragile vitality lingered, a testament to resilience where there had been only vulnerability. Elara's reflective eyes, sharp and clear, mirrored this delicate balance. She felt the weight of everything lost, and yet the faint stirrings of something new, a fragile hope that blossomed amidst ruin. Near the far corner, Myra knelt beside a child whose arm had splintered in the chaos. Her soft hands moved with practiced care, whispering soothing words that wove warmth into the cold sterility that had once defined these halls. Myra's presence was a balm, her nurturing spirit steady and unwavering. The quiet murmur of her voice, the gentle touch, offered a contrast to the coldness that had permeated the orphanage's soul. Elara watched her, grateful for the steadfast anchor Myra provided. Jax, disheveled and restless, prowled the peripheral shadows with an intensity born of recent struggles. His quick, darting eyes scanned the damaged security monitors and broken locks, every flicker of emergency light revealing the wear of countless sleepless nights. Yet beneath the exhaustion, a fire burned, a determination to protect what remained and to carry the truth beyond these shattered walls. The scars of his rebellion were etched deeply, but so too was his hope for freedom and justice. Elara's gaze returned to Lumen, who paused beside her at a fractured window. The morning sun cast fractured rainbows across their glass faces, a kaleidoscope of color that seemed to breathe life into the desolation. In that silent moment, mother and child, protector and hope, stood united in reverence. The delicate balance between fragility and strength was not a weakness, but a new kind of power, one forged in the fire of loss and tempered by the promise of renewal. "We survive," Elara whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Together, Lumen's glowing heart pulsed in quiet affirmation, a steady rhythm that echoed through the ruins and into the uncertain future. Around them, the shattered children stirred, their fragile forms reflecting a world forever changed but not yet broken. The orphanage lay broken, its walls scarred and its glass children cracked but alive. From the wreckage, a new dawn beckoned, uncertain, fragile but real. Elara's transformation was complete. No longer the detached caretaker, she was a fierce guardian, a beacon of hope for the vulnerable souls entrusted to her care. As the light shifted and the shadows receded, Elara felt the weight of her new responsibility settle firmly on her shoulders. The threat of shattering still lingered, but so too did the fragile strength of resilience. The future was uncharted, a delicate thread woven between loss and hope. And for the first time in a long while, Elara dared to believe in the possibility of healing. Outside the broken windows, the world waited, cold, indifferent, yet filled with the faintest shimmer of promise. The glass children, with their fragile bodies and beating hearts, stood at the cusp of a fragile tomorrow. And Elara, their unwavering guardian, was ready to face whatever came next. But the question remained, heavy and unspoken. How long could fragile hope endure in a world that threatened to shatter it at every turn? The answer lay in the days ahead, in the strength found within brokenness, and in the luminous heart that beat beneath the glass. And so, beneath the fractured light, the story continued, fragile, haunting, and filled with desperate hope. The early light of dawn crept slowly across the shattered remnants of the orphanage, casting fractured beams through the cracked window panes. Elara stood motionless beside the broken glass, her sharp, reflective eyes tracing the delicate silhouettes of the surviving children as they huddled quietly in the courtyard. The silence was thick, a fragile veil that seemed to hold both sorrow and promise. The air smelled faintly of cold metal and distant rain, a reminder of the ordeal they had endured. The courtyard was a mosaic of broken shards, glittering under the pale sun like scattered stars fallen to earth. There, amidst the fractured beauty, stood Lumen, the heart child, whose translucent form shimmered faintly with pulses of light. Elara watched the child's slender fingers reach out hesitantly, brushing against the jagged edges of a glass fragment. The faint glow from Lumen's beating heart beneath their ribs cast a gentle warmth that seemed almost impossible against the cold silence surrounding them. It was a moment of tender vulnerability, a reminder that beneath the delicate surface lay a spark of life that refused to be extinguished. Elara's breath caught as she saw the child's gaze lift, meeting hers with a quiet, innocent curiosity. In that glance was the unspoken truth of their shared survival, the fragile hope that had carried them through the night's darkness. The orphanage was broken, scarred by conflict and loss, but these children remained. And in them, a new dawn was beginning. Inside the dimly lit common room, Myra and Jax sat close to a flickering terminal, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. Their voices were low but firm as they conferred, weaving cautious plans to rebuild the fragile sanctuary. Myra's nurturing warmth balanced Jax's restless energy. Together, they embodied the resolve to protect the children from the looming threats that still shadowed their fragile existence. "We can't let what happened happen again," Myra whispered, her eyes reflecting a fierce loyalty. Jax nodded, fingers dancing over the keyboard. "We'll need new defenses and a way to keep the outside world at bay. But more than that, we need to keep their spirits alive." Their determination was a quiet rebellion against the cold authority that had sought to control and exploit. Elara knew that the path ahead was fraught with danger, but with allies like Myra and Jax, the fragile hope that flickered within these walls might yet endure. Later, alone in her sparse quarters, Elara stood before a cracked mirror. Her reflection was fractured, lines and fissures running through the glass like the scars on her soul. Yet within those breaks, there was a resilience, a refusal to be undone. She traced the contours of her pale face, the eyes that mirrored the glass children's delicate fragility, and felt the weight of responsibility settle upon her. In the stillness, she reached for a pen and paper, her hands steady despite the turmoil within. She wrote a silent vow, words meant only for herself and the children she had come to cherish. "I will protect you, no matter the cost. In this world of shards and shadows, I will be your guardian. Your fragility will be met with strength, your innocence with fierce love. Together, we will find a way through the darkness." The promise was a seed planted in the fertile soil of loss and hope. As the sun rose higher, casting light into the orphanage's broken halls, Elara turned from the mirror with renewed purpose. The new dawn was fragile, uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. Outside, Lumen's faint heartbeat echoed softly, a rhythm of life that refused to be silenced. And in that steady pulse, Elara found the courage to face whatever trials awaited, knowing that the delicate balance between fragility and strength was not a weakness, but a testament to the enduring spirit within them all. The orphanage, scarred but unbroken, awaited the coming day, a day where innocence could be protected and new beginnings forged amidst the shards of the past. Elara's journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, there was a quiet hope that whispered through the glass walls, promising a future where even the most fragile could shine brilliantly. As she stepped back into the light, Elara's eyes caught Lumen's once more, their glowing heart a beacon in the dawn. The fragile children were no longer just delicate creations. They were survivors, bearers of a fragile tomorrow that she was sworn to protect. And so, with the rising sun casting its fractured light across the world, Elara embraced her new role, not merely as a caretaker, but as a guardian of fragile hope, ready to face the uncertain future with courage born from the shattered past. The story of the glass children was far from finished. It was only just beginning. The caretaker's quarters were nearly silent, save for the subtle hum of ventilation and the faint, occasional creak of the building settling against the night. Elara sat alone on the edge of her narrow cot, eyes locked on the cracked glass figurine resting in her palms. The delicate sculpture, once whole and gleaming, now bore jagged fractures, each shard catching the dim light and splintering it into shards of shadow that danced across the sterile walls. The sight stirred a quiet ache within her, an echo from a past she had long tried to contain. Memories came unbidden, flooding her mind with scenes from a laboratory far removed from this cold orphanage. She was younger then, her hair pulled back tightly, face alight, with the fervor of scientific discovery. The lab was a cacophony of beeping machines and murmured voices, technicians and researchers bustling about like ants driven by purpose. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Ethics committees clashed with corporate executives, and the line between science and morality blurred dangerously. Elara had watched as her colleagues rationalized experiments that created beings like the glass children, creations designed to be perfect, controllable, and ultimately disposable. Her heart tightened at the memory of the day she walked away. A heated argument, voices raised in frustration and despair, and then silence as she turned her back on the project. She remembered the weight of her decision, the guilt that followed, and the hollow feeling of abandoning something she once believed in. Her departure was not a triumphant escape, but a fracture, a break in her own fragile humanity. Back in the present, the soft knock at her door startled her. Myra entered quietly, her familiar presence a balm against the loneliness that threatened to consume Elara. The assistant caretaker's warm eyes met hers, filled with unspoken understanding. "You've been quiet tonight," Myra said softly, taking the cracked figurine from Elara's hands to examine it. "It reminds me of everything I left behind," Elara admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "The failures, the compromises. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just as fragile as the children I care for." Myra settled beside her, the late afternoon sun spilling through the window and casting long, fragile shadows across the room. "Fragility isn't weakness," she said gently. "It's a part of life, something to be embraced, not feared. You've protected them despite everything. That takes strength." Their conversation drifted to the children playing quietly in the garden, their translucent forms glimmering like shards of light. Elara's mind returned to Lumen, the heart-bearing child who had become the center of her world. The child's silent vitality was a beacon against the darkness of the orphanage's secrets and the cold ambitions of Director Voss. Later, Elara stood before the fractured mirror in the hallway. Her reflection was broken, fragmented across jagged lines, yet within those shards, she saw a fierce determination kindling. The fractured image was a testament to her past and the emotional scars that shaped her, but it was also a symbol of resilience. She was no longer the detached scientist who walked away in fear. Now she was a protector, a guardian willing to confront the shadows that threatened the fragile lives in her care. The echoes of her past would not be silenced, but they would no longer dictate her future. With steady breath, Elara turned away from the mirror and into the dim corridor, ready to face whatever came next. The fragile children depended on her, and she would not let them shatter. As the night deepened, the orphanage held its breath, suspended between fragility and strength, innocence, and survival. Elara's journey was far from over, but in embracing her fractured past, she found the courage to protect the fragile tomorrow waiting beyond the glass. The early dawn cast a pale glow through the narrow windows of the orphanage, bathing the sterile halls in a soft, muted light that seemed almost reluctant to disturb the fragile quiet within. Myra moved gently down the corridor, her hands steady though her heart trembled with the weight of responsibility that came with each delicate life she touched. In her arms, one of the glass children rested, a small, translucent figure whose fragile limbs shimmered faintly, catching the light like a prism. Myra's voice was a mere whisper, a soothing murmur that seemed to weave warmth into the cold air. There, she breathed, her breath fogging slightly against the child's fragile surface. You're safe. We're here. The child's glass form seemed to pulse subtly in response, a soft glow emanating from within like the flicker of a candle struggling against a draft. Myra's eyes softened, reflecting the fragile beauty before her, a living testament to innocence trapped in crystal. The orphanage, once a place of sterile control and clinical detachment, had become a fragile sanctuary where care was measured in the gentlest touch, the quietest word. Meanwhile, beneath the surface of the orphanage, in the labyrinthine network of maintenance tunnels and forgotten conduits, Jax moved with practiced stealth. His quick, darting eyes scanned the dim spaces as his fingers worked deftly to disable surveillance nodes and bypass locked systems. Each lock he picked, each camera he blinded, was a small victory against the oppressive oversight that Director Voss had imposed like a suffocating shroud. Jax's disheveled appearance belied the sharpness of his mind and the depth of his commitment. His rebellious spirit was fueled not by anger alone, but by a fierce desire to reclaim freedom for the children who had become pawns in a cold game of control and exploitation. As he slipped through the shadows, the faint hum of machinery and the distant echoes of footsteps reminded him of the stakes. Failure was not an option. Above, in the orphanage's central hall, Elara stood surrounded by the shards of broken glass and scattered memories. Her pale, slender form was framed by the fractured light filtering through the shattered panes, her sharp eyes reflecting the kaleidoscopic patterns cast by Lumen's faintly glowing heart beneath their translucent ribs. The child stood close beside her, their fragile body pulsing with a vitality that defied the cold sterility of their surroundings. Myra approached quietly, her presence a balm to the tension that clung to Elara's shoulders. Jax joined them moments later, silent but resolute, his eyes speaking volumes in the absence of words. Together, they formed a fragile triad of guardianship, each bringing strength born from vulnerability, each committed to protecting the delicate balance of life within these walls. The children gathered nearby, drawn to the warmth of their protectors like moths to a distant flame. Their translucent forms clustered in a trembling circle of light and glass, the reflections they cast shimmering against cracked walls and shattered dreams. Myra's soft lullaby floated through the air, a thread of melody woven from hope and memory, binding the fragile group in a moment of serene unity. Elara felt the weight of their gaze, the quiet trust that these fragile beings placed in her hands. The journey they faced was fraught with peril. Director Voss's agents still lurked beyond the shadows, their cold intent threatening to fracture the sanctuary built from glass and hope. Yet in this fragile moment, surrounded by the silent guardians who stood unwavering, Elara found a sliver of strength she had thought lost. "We are not alone," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "Together, we will hold them." Myra's gentle smile was a beacon of warmth, and Jax's fierce eyes burned with determination. The fragile children, with their shimmering bodies and beating heart, were the living reflections of resilience amid vulnerability. Their future rested on this fragile alliance, a testament to the power found in unity and quiet courage. As the lullaby faded into silence, the orphanage seemed to pulse with a new rhythm, one forged from the mingling of innocence and defiance, fragility and strength. The shadows might stretch long and cold, but within these walls, the silent guardians stood ready, watchful and unyielding, to protect the fragile light that flickered in the heart of glass. The path ahead was uncertain, and the threat of shattering lingered like a breath on glass. Yet in the shared strength of Myra's nurturing warmth, Jax's rebellious spirit, and Elara's steadfast resolve, a fragile hope blossomed, one that might yet endure the coming storm. And so, as the first rays of sunlight pierced the gray dawn, the orphanage held its breath, waiting for the next move in a game where every shard of glass could mean salvation or destruction. But for now, the children were safe, cradled in the hands of silent guardians who would fight to the last breath to keep their fragile world whole. The lullaby resumed softly, a fragile thread weaving through the cold air, a promise whispered between shadows. No matter what splintered, something beautiful would remain. The sterile silence of the archive room was punctuated only by the soft hum of the holographic interface, its translucent panels pulsing faintly under Elara's fingertips. She sat motionless for long moments, eyes narrowed, reflecting the shards of data dancing before her. Beside her, Jax's disheveled figure leaned in close, eyes darting rapidly as he decrypted layer upon layer of encryption. The truth was buried deep within the orphanage's digital veins, a hidden network of intentions more sinister than even Elara had feared. "Look at this," Jax whispered, voice low but urgent. "They're not just creating these children as experiments or curiosities, they're planning to weaponize them." Elara's breath caught. The files revealed protocols for manipulating the glass children's unique physical properties, fragility twisted into a tool for destruction. The delicate beings, symbols of innocence and vulnerability, were to be transformed into cold instruments of control. The stark contrast between the children's translucent beauty and the clinical coldness of the plans sent a shiver through her. This is monstrous," Elara murmured, fingers trembling as she reached out to touch the glowing data. "We can't let this happen." Jax's eyes met hers, fierce yet laced with exhaustion. "We need proof. We need to expose them." Outside the archive, soft footsteps echoed down the sterile corridors. Myra appeared, her presence a balm amid the tension. Her soft features were etched with concern as she approached the two conspirators. "How are the children?" she asked quietly. Elara glanced toward the observation window where faint silhouettes of the glass children shimmered, their fragile forms casting prismatic reflections onto the cold floors. "They're scared. They don't understand what's coming." Myra nodded, her hands moving instinctively to soothe a trembling figure nearby, a child whose glass limbs flickered with the slightest tremors. The moment was fragile, a tender interlude underscored by the looming threat. "We have to protect them," Myra said softly, "no matter what." Meanwhile, in the upper echelons of the orphanage, Director Voss stood behind a thick pane of reflective glass. His tall, austere figure was fractured by the distorted light, casting shards of shadow across his cold face. The pane mirrored his fractured morality, a man driven by loss and obsession, willing to sacrifice everything for control. His gaze was unyielding, eyes sharp as flint as he watched the unfolding resistance. To him, the children were assets, not lives, tools to be molded and controlled. Back in the archive, Elara's own reflection caught her eye, distorted and fragmented in the cracked glass panel beside her. It mirrored the turmoil within her, the shattering of illusions, the painful acknowledgement of complicity, and the fragile hope that still flickered beneath the surface. "I won't let them destroy what's left of innocence here," she vowed, voice steady despite the weight pressing down on her. Jax placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent promise of solidarity. "Then we fight, together." The room seemed to hold its breath as plans were laid, alliances forged in whispered urgency. Outside, the orphanage's cold walls concealed the brewing storm, a clash between fragile life and merciless ambition. As Elara prepared to face the coming darkness, the motif of reflection echoed in every glance, every shard of glass, a reminder that truth, like glass, could be shattered but also refracted into new light. The battle was no longer just for survival, it was for the very soul of the children and the fragile hope they embodied. The night deepened, shadows lengthening as Elara stood before the cracked glass once more. Her own image fractured but unbroken, she whispered into the silence, "For them, I will be unbreakable." With the dawn still distant, the fragile war for innocence and identity was only just beginning. The infirmary's sterile glow cast long, wavering shadows across the pale forms of the glass children, as Elara sat beside Lumen, her fingers tracing the delicate contours of the child's translucent limbs. The faint pulse beneath the delicate ribs was visible, a soft, rhythmic glow that seemed almost impossibly alive within the fragile cage of glass. She held her breath, watching as the tiny heart beat steadily, a beacon of life against the cold sterility of their surroundings. "It's more than just glass," Elara whispered, her voice barely carrying in the stillness. "You're more than what they made you to be." Lumen's eyes, clear and deep, met hers, silent but filled with an innocence that transcended the fragile medium that encased them. For a moment, the orphanage faded away, the harsh walls, the clinical hum, the ever-watchful eyes of security, and all that remained was the fragile beating heart and the quiet connection between caretaker and child. Myra's soft footsteps interrupted the silence as she entered, carrying a small tray of supplies. Her warm smile was a balm to Elara's weariness. "They're all waiting," Myra said gently. "The others, they look to Lumen differently now, like they see something real." Elara nodded, a mixture of hope and dread tightening in her chest. Lumen was no longer just a fragile experiment but a symbol of life, of hope, of resistance against the encroaching darkness Director Voss represented. Later, in a dimly lit room hidden beneath the orphanage's labyrinthine corridors, Elara met with Myra and Jax. The air was thick with quiet urgency, the flickering fluorescent lights casting jittery shadows that danced across their determined faces. "We can't just wait for them to come," Jax said sharply, his eyes bright with rebellious fire. "Lumen's heart, it's a sign. The children are beginning to sense something. We need to prepare." Myra nodded, her voice steady despite the tension. "We'll protect them, whatever it takes." Elara's gaze was fixed on the faint pulse she imagined echoing in her mind, the living heart beneath glass, fragile but persistent. "Then we fight back," she said finally, the weight of her words settling around them like the cold walls they sought to protect. In the central hall, the glass children gathered, their bodies catching the artificial light and fracturing it into shards of color that shimmered like living stained glass. They moved in delicate harmony, their mirrored forms casting fractured reflections that multiplied infinitely across the walls and floor. Lumen reached out, fingertips grazing the faces of the others, sending ripples of prismatic light dancing across the room. The silence was broken not by words, but by a profound, shared understanding, a fragile solidarity forged in the clarity of their translucent forms. Elara watched from the shadows, her heart swelling with a fierce protectiveness. The children were no longer passive objects of an experiment. They were a living testament to hope, to innocence preserved against overwhelming odds. Night deepened, and Elara found herself standing alone before the vast observation window that overlooked the sprawling city beyond. The lights glittered distantly, blurred by the cold glass pane. Her reflection merged with the faint glow of Lumen's heart etched in her memory, a haunting reminder of the delicate balance between fragility and strength. She breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the days past and the uncertain road ahead. "We are fragile," she whispered to the night, "but we are not broken." The orphanage was a fragile sanctuary, a place where glass and heart entwined in a delicate dance. And within that fragile heart lay the promise of something new, a future where innocence could endure, where hope could survive the shadows. As the first light of dawn threatened the darkness, Elara's resolve hardened. The struggle was far from over, but with Lumen's glowing heart to guide them, the children had found a reason to fight back. The glass had a heart, after all, and it beat defiantly against the cold. And so, beneath the fragile surface of glass and shadow, a quiet revolution began. The fluorescent lights flickered as an uneasy silence settled over the central hall of the orphanage, the sterile walls reflecting shards of broken glass like fractured stars. Elara stood rigid, her slender frame poised between the rows of fragile children who huddled close, their translucent forms shimmering faintly in the cold light. Each breath she took was measured, her sharp eyes mirroring the crystalline innocence around her, fixed on the figure approaching down the corridor. Director Voss entered with the measured stride of a man accustomed to command, his tall, austere figure cutting a stark silhouette against the gleaming surfaces. His cold eyes, behind the reflective glass panes of his office, had always unnerved Elara, but now, standing face to face, the chill in his gaze felt like a physical weight. The orphanage, once a sanctuary of delicate beauty, now felt like a battleground for souls. "Elara," Voss began, voice smooth but edged with steel. "You know why I'm here. The child, the anomaly, cannot remain. Your interference jeopardizes everything." Elara's heart pounded, not with fear but fierce determination. "Lumen is more than an experiment," she said quietly, stepping forward. "They are alive. They have a beating heart, a soul. You can't just erase that because it doesn't fit your design." A silence fell, broken only by the soft tapping of glass feet as Lumen emerged from the cluster of children. The child's faintly glowing heart pulsed beneath their translucent ribs, casting ripples of light that danced across the faces of those present. Lumen's eyes, wide and innocent, met Elara's, and in that gaze, a fragile hope blossomed. "You don't understand," Voss replied, his voice cold but tinged with something almost like sorrow. "This project was designed to eliminate weakness, to create control where chaos once reigned. The children are our future, but anomalies like Lumen threaten that future with unpredictability. Control at the cost of humanity is no future at all," Elara retorted. "I won't let you destroy what little innocence remains here." Suddenly, the doors burst open. Security lead Royce stormed in, flanked by heavily armed agents. The tension shattered like glass underfoot. Myra and Jax moved swiftly, their presence a needed counterbalance to the looming threat. Myra's warm voice tried to soothe the frightened children, while Jax, with his quick, darting eyes, coordinated a plan to protect Lumen and disrupt the intruders. Elara's mind raced. The fragility of the children meant any misstep could be catastrophic, yet the fierce protectiveness swelling inside her pushed her forward. "Stand down," she commanded, voice ringing with authority and desperation. "These children are not your property to seize or destroy." Voss's expression darkened, and he raised a hand signaling Royce. The room tensed as if holding its breath. In that charged moment, Lumen stepped forward, trembling but steady, their tiny hand reaching out to touch the nearest child. The light from their beating heart flared briefly, bathing the room in a warm glow. The agents hesitated, caught off guard by the undeniable life radiating from the fragile figure. Elara seized the moment. "See them not as experiments or assets," she implored, "but as beings deserving of compassion and protection. If you destroy them, you destroy a part of yourself." Voss's eyes flickered with a complex mix of anger and something deeper, regret, perhaps. For a heartbeat, the cold facade cracked. But Royce advanced, weapon raised. In a swift move, Jax intercepted, his voice sharp as he barked orders to the children, guiding them to safety. Myra gathered the youngest, her nurturing presence a balm amid the chaos. The confrontation exploded into a desperate struggle. Glass shattered, hearts raced, and emotions broke free in torrents. Elara fought not just against physical foes, but against the crushing weight of control and dehumanization. Her compassion became a shield, her courage a weapon. As the dust settled, the orphanage lay fractured, both in structure and spirit. But amid the ruins, Lumen's glowing heart still beat steady, a fragile beacon of hope. Elara, breathless and bruised, knew the battle was far from over. Yet, in this moment of vulnerability and strength entwined, she found a resolve fiercer than ever. "This isn't the end," she whispered, gazing at the children whose light reflected in her eyes. "It's only the beginning." Outside, the shadows deepened, but within the shattered glass, a new dawn awaited, fragile, uncertain, but undeniably alive. The shattered corridors of the orphanage echoed with the brittle symphony of breaking glass, a sound that was both terrifying and strangely beautiful, like the death throes of a fragile world. Elara moved through the wreckage with a fierce tenderness, her slender hands trembling but unyielding as she shielded Lumen's delicate form, the translucent child whose faintly glowing heart pulsed with an impossible life. Each beat sent ripples of light trembling beneath the glass ribs, casting faint, ghostly reflections on Elara's pale, sharp-featured face. Director Voss emerged from the shadows, his austere figure framed by the jagged remnants of the orphanage's once pristine walls. His cold eyes, the color of storm clouds behind glass panes, locked onto Elara with a calculating intensity. "Give me the child," he demanded, voice low and unwavering, the weight of corporate power and personal obsession coiled tightly within each word. "This anomaly is the key to everything we envisioned. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment." Elara's breath caught, but her resolve hardened like tempered crystal. "Lumen isn't your property," she said quietly, voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "You don't get to decide what life is." A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant shouts of security forces clashing with the desperate resistance led by Myra and Jax. Myra's warm, nurturing presence was a beacon of calm amid the chaos, her soft features etched with determination as she moved quickly to tend to the other fragile children, her hands gentle but sure. Jax's sharp, darting eyes flickered with rebellion and hope, his every move a calculated act of defiance against the cold machinery of control. The confrontation escalated swiftly. Security lead Royce appeared, his imposing frame blocking the path, enforcing Director Voss's commands with ruthless efficiency. Caretaker Dane, ever the detached enforcer of rules, hesitated briefly at the scene's emotional intensity, but soon sided with the security forces, embodying the orphanage's impersonal authority. Elara stepped forward, placing herself between Lumen and the encroaching threat. The child's luminous heart beat faster, as though sensing the danger and summoning a fragile courage born of innocence and defiance. With a sudden, shattering cry, a pane of glass exploded nearby, shards scattering like deadly rain. The sound was horrifying and exquisite, a brutal punctuation to the fragile balance that had held for so long. In the chaos, Elara's protective instincts surged. She caught Lumen's trembling hand, their fingers entwined, and a warm light blossomed between them. The boundaries between artificial and living blurred, the glass child's ethereal form shimmering with an almost human vitality. Elara felt her own barriers crumble, emotions she had long suppressed flooding through her, fear, love, desperation. "You don't understand," Voss hissed, advancing with the cold certainty of a man driven by loss and obsession. "This is evolution, control, perfection." "No," Elara whispered fiercely, "it's humanity, it's life." The battle reached its crescendo as both sides clashed physically and ideologically. Glass shattered beneath frantic feet, children's fragile bodies cracked and splintered, their eerie beauty marred by damage. Yet from the brokenness emerged a new strength, a testament to resilience born from fragility. Elara's eyes shone with tears and resolve as she fought not just for survival, but for a redefinition of existence. Lumen's heart pulsed in synchrony with hers, a beacon of hope amid the ruins. The orphanage, once a cold sanctuary of control, was now a battleground where innocence and cruelty collided, where reflection was no longer just in glass, but in the soul. As the dust settled and the echoes of conflict faded, Elara stood amidst the wreckage, shattered, scarred, yet unbroken. The fragile children, some broken, some whole, gathered around her, their translucent forms catching the faint light like fragments of a shattered dream reborn. The line between artificial and living had been irrevocably blurred. In that fragile space, Elara found a fierce new purpose. The future was uncertain, shadowed by loss and fear, but also illuminated by the fragile, flickering light of hope. She tightened her grip on Lumen's hand and whispered, "We will be whole again." And somewhere beneath the broken glass and quiet ashes, a heart continued to beat, fragile, resilient, and alive. The chapter closes on Elara's fierce, tearful gaze as she shields Lumen, the orphanage fractured but not defeated. The haunting melody of broken glass lingers, a reminder that even in shatteredness, there is the possibility of wholeness. What new paths will Elara and the children forge from the ruins? The answer waits beyond the fragile dawn. The dawn crept slowly over the shattered remains of the orphanage, casting pale light on jagged shards of glass that littered the cold floor like fallen stars. Elara stood silent amidst the ruins, the weight of loss pressing heavily against her chest. Her reflective eyes, sharp and clear as the fragile children she had tended, scanned the devastation. The sterile walls she once knew so well were fractured, cracked, and broken, a mirror to the shattered innocence she sought to protect. Every breath she drew was thick with the scent of smoke and dust, a harsh reminder of the violence that had fractured their sanctuary. Yet even in this desolation, there was a glimmer, a fragile hope that refused to be extinguished. Lumen, the heart-bearing child, moved slowly through the wreckage, translucent form flickering with faint pulses of light. The child's delicate hand reached out, gathering shards of glass scattered like forgotten memories, as if attempting to piece together not only the physical fragments, but the broken spirit of their home. Elara's gaze softened as she watched Lumen's gentle movements. The child's radiant presence was a beacon in the gloom, a living testament to resilience amidst fragility. It was this paradox, the simultaneous vulnerability and strength, that anchored Elara's resolve. She knelt beside Lumen, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the child's cool, glassy skin. "We will make it whole again," she whispered, voice steady despite the quiver beneath. Behind them, Myra moved quietly through the corridors, her soft features etched with exhaustion yet glowing with steadfast warmth. She wrapped a trembling child in a worn blanket, her soothing voice weaving threads of comfort through the cold, broken hallways. "You're safe now," Myra murmured, her words a balm against the lingering echoes of fear. The children, their translucent forms fractured but still luminous, huddled close, seeking solace in small acts of tenderness. Not far off, Jax worked with focused determination, his disheveled hair falling into darting eyes that scanned the damaged security panel he was hastily repairing. Each precise movement echoed the urgency of their fragile future being pieced together. The orphanage's defenses, once cold and impersonal, were now imbued with a new purpose, the protection of lives that mattered beyond mere experiments or profit. Elara rose, her slender frame silhouetted against the growing light. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with peril. The scars left by Director Voss and his forces were deep, not only in the broken walls, but in the hearts of those who survived. Yet within this crucible of loss, Elara felt a stirring of something fierce and unyielding. She was no longer the detached scientist or the cautious caretaker. She was a guardian, a fierce protector of fragile lives, a fierce advocate for hope amid despair. Her voice broke the heavy silence. "We will rebuild, not just this place, but everything it stands for." She met the eyes of Myra, Jax, and Lumen, finding in them the reflection of her own renewed purpose. The children, once mere glass creations, were now symbols of resilience and new beginnings. As the sun rose higher, casting prisms of light through the broken panes, the orphanage breathed again, fragile, yes, but alive. And in that fragile breath lay the promise of a future where innocence could be nurtured, where reflection was not only in glass, but in the soul. Elara stepped forward, each footfall a quiet vow. The ashes of the past would feed the roots of tomorrow, and no matter how delicate, no matter how easily shattered, they would endure. But even as hope blossomed, shadows lingered. The world beyond the orphanage's walls was watching, waiting. And Elara knew the true test had only just begun. She glanced down at Lumen's glowing heart, faint but steady beneath fragile ribs. "Together," she whispered, "we will face whatever comes next." The orphanage was broken, but it was not defeated, and neither was she. Outside, the first rays of dawn caught on a shard of glass, fracturing light into 1,000 colors, a fragile, beautiful promise of what could still be. The story of the glass children was far from over. It was only just beginning. The ruins of the once sterile orphanage lay, scattered beneath a sky that blurred the line between dusk and night. The pale hues of twilight filtering through shattered glass and fractured steel like a fragile promise. Elara moved slowly among the remnants, her pale fingers brushing lightly against the broken edges, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of what remained. Around her, the surviving glass children huddled close, their translucent bodies flickering with faint pulses of light, reflections intertwining with shadows in a dance as old as fragility itself. At the center of the gathering stood Lumen, their glass ribs faintly aglow with the rhythmic thrum of a real, beating heart. That soft pulse was a beacon, a fragile light in the encroaching darkness. Elara's sharp, reflective eyes mirrored the child's glow, a quiet determination settling deep within her. This was no longer just an orphanage. It was a sanctuary where innocence, though broken, could still survive and grow. Myra knelt beside a small, cracked figure, her warm hands cradling the child with careful reverence. Her soft features, worn but resolute, reflected a fierce loyalty that transcended the ruins. "They're looking to you," Myra whispered to Elara, her voice steady despite the weight of the night. "They need your strength." Elara nodded, swallowing the tightness in her throat. The memories of loss and fear still lingered like ghosts, but here, among these fragile beings, she found a new purpose. She crouched closer to Lumen, her breath catching as the child's glowing heart pulsed steadily beneath the glass surface. "You're the light," she murmured, her voice trembling with awe. "The fragile light that won't go out." Jax moved deftly through the shadows of the crumbled walls, his disheveled form a stark contrast to the eerie stillness around him. His quick, darting eyes scanned the perimeter, alert for threats both seen and unseen. Spotting Elara, he paused, offering a nod that spoke volumes, a silent vow to stand alongside her in this fragile new world. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and shattered dreams, yet beneath it all, a quiet warmth blossomed. The children's surreal, otherworldly behaviors softened, their luminescent forms intertwining in gentle gestures of trust and connection. The orphanage's sterile coldness was gone, replaced by something infinitely more precious. A fragile hope that flickered in the spaces between broken glass and whispered promises. Elara rose, feeling the weight of her transformation settle like a mantle over her shoulders. No longer the detached scientist or cautious caretaker, she was now the guardian of a delicate future. The shards of the past would not define them. Instead, they would be the foundation upon which new light was built. As twilight deepened, Lumen's heart pulsed brighter, casting rippling reflections that danced across the walls and the faces of those gathered. It was a testament to resilience, a fragile, shining defiance against the darkness that threatened to consume them. And in that fragile glow, Elara saw the promise of a tomorrow where innocence could be fiercely protected, where the delicate balance of vulnerability and strength was not a weakness, but a source of power. The journey ahead would not be easy, but together they would face it, glass and light entwined, unbreakable in their fragile hope. The night whispered around them, but Elara stood unwavering, her heart aligned with the steady beat beneath Lumen's glass ribs. "We will endure," she vowed softly, "because we must, because this light is worth everything." Outside, the first stars began to pierce the gathering darkness, their distant shimmer a quiet chorus to the fragile symphony unfolding within the shattered walls. And as the orphanage settled into uneasy silence, the glow of a single, beating heart illuminated a path forward, fragile, luminous, and fiercely alive. The morning light filtered softly through the fractured window panes of the orphanage's main hall, casting fractured patterns of shadow and brilliance across the cold floor. Elara stood silently before the broken glass, her sharp, reflective eyes tracing the shimmering shards that caught the dawn's hesitant glow. Each splintered fragment seemed to tell a story, a mosaic of past failures, shattered hopes, and fragile dreams waiting to be reassembled. The air was still, charged with the quiet pulse of new beginnings, tempered by the weight of what had been lost. In this fragile light, Elara felt the deep stirrings of a renewed resolve. The long nights of fear and desperation, the heavy burden of protecting the glass children from forces that sought to exploit or destroy them, had carved deep lines in her soul. Yet now, amidst the ruins of the orphanage, there was a whisper of something stronger, a fragile hope that could not be broken so easily. It was a hope born not just from survival, but from an understanding that fragility and strength were not opposites, but intertwined threads in the same delicate fabric. Behind her, the soft murmur of voices drew her attention. Myra sat in a quiet corner, her gentle hands cradling a small glass child whose translucent fingers curled faintly around her own. The child's fragile form shimmered with pulses of light, each flicker a testament to the delicate life within. Myra's presence was a balm, her warmth and nurturing spirit a stark contrast to the cold sterility that had once defined the orphanage. Nearby, Jax leaned over a hollow display, his disheveled hair falling into sharp, darting eyes as he traced the blueprints of the damaged facility. His rebellious spirit had found new purpose here, a chance to right the wrongs he had once been complicit in. Elara approached the pair, the soft sound of her footsteps a quiet rhythm in the hushed room. "We have a long road ahead," she said, her voice steady yet carrying the weight of unspoken fears and fierce determination. "But we will build something better, something that honors their fragility and their strength." Myra looked up, her soft features illuminated by the glow of the holographic table. The children need more than shelter. They need safety, understanding, and a place where their uniqueness is respected. Jax nodded, tapping a sequence on the interface. "I've been working on new security protocols, less intrusive but effective. We can shield them without making this a prison." Lumen appeared then, stepping into the pool of light near the window. The child's translucent glass body shimmered faintly, the faint glow of a real beating heart visible beneath the ribs, a beacon of life and hope amid the fragile forms around. Lumen reached out a delicate hand, sending ripples of reflected light dancing across the walls. The reflections flickered like living memories, fragile yet persistent, much like the child herself. Elara's gaze softened. "You've become our heart," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "a symbol of everything we're fighting to protect." The group fell into a solemn silence, bound by shared purpose and the heavy knowledge of what was at stake. The orphanage's shattered state was a physical scar, but it also symbolized the emotional fractures they had endured. Yet within those cracks, light found a way to seep through. Hours passed as they mapped out plans, renewed architectural designs emphasizing openness and safety, ethical frameworks that would govern the care of the children, and protocols to prevent exploitation. Each decision was a careful balance, a negotiation between vulnerability and resilience. Elara reflected on her own transformation. Once a detached scientist, then a reluctant caretaker, she now embraced her role as protector with fierce courage and renewed empathy. The reflections in the glass children's eyes mirrored her own journey, fragile yet unyielding, fractured but whole. As twilight deepened outside, Elara returned to the shattered window. She reached out, fingertips brushing a jagged edge. The glass was cold, sharp, and unyielding, yet in its fractured beauty, she saw the possibility of renewal. The reflection staring back was not the same as before. It was tempered by sorrow, illuminated by hope, and strengthened by the knowledge that even in the most delicate forms, resilience could be born. "We will rise," she whispered into the quiet. "Fragile, yes, but unbroken." The chapter closed not with certainty, but with a promise, a fragile tomorrow where reflections were not just echoes of the past, but the light that guided the way forward. The first light of dawn filtered through the fractured glass panes of the orphanage's main hall, scattering shards of pale illumination across the cold floor. Elara stood silently by the great window, her sharp eyes reflecting the fractured light in patterns that seemed to dance like ghostly echoes of the past. Around her, the surviving glass children gathered in clusters, their translucent bodies catching and refracting the dawn's glow, fragile and beautiful as ever. Lumen, the heart-bearing child, stood slightly apart, the faint pulse of life beneath their ribs casting a gentle radiance that contrasted with the coldness of the shattered walls. Elara's breath came slow and steady as she surveyed the scene before her. The orphanage lay broken, its sterile perfection shattered by the chaos of the recent conflict. Yet in this ruin, a fragile hope stirred. The children, delicate as the glass they were made from, had endured. Their innocence remained unbroken, shimmering like the morning light on fractured crystal. Moving away from the window, Elara crossed the hall with measured steps, her fingers trailing lightly over the smooth surfaces of the children as she passed. Each touch was a promise, a vow to protect them from the outside world's harshness. She paused by Lumen, who was crouched by a small sprout pushing through a crack in the floor. The child's glowing heart cast a soft light on the tender green shoot, a symbol of life persisting against all odds. "Do you see it, Lumen?" Elara whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The child's eyes, wide and luminous, met hers in quiet understanding. Lumen's tiny hand reached out, fingertips brushing the delicate leaves, their touch sending scattered prisms of light flickering across the broken floor. In that moment, Elara felt the weight of everything she had fought for, the fragile boundary between protection and freedom, between vulnerability and resilience. The children were more than glass and light. They were living reflections of hope, fragile yet unyielding. Behind her, soft footsteps approached. Myra appeared, her presence a balm to the tense quiet. She moved among the children with gentle care, her voice a soothing murmur that wove warmth through the cool air. Nearby, Jax lingered by the entrance, his restless gaze scanning the horizon, ever watchful. The trio formed a fragile circle of guardianship around the children, each bringing their strengths to bear in this uncertain new dawn. Elara allowed herself a brief moment of respite, leaning against the cold wall as her eyes traced the shards of glass in a small sculpture crafted from the orphanage's remnants. Each fragment caught the light differently, some sharp and jagged, others smooth and curved, mirroring the fractured memories she carried within. Past failures, lost hopes, and the fierce love that had grown in the shadow of those losses all converged in this fragile symbol. Tomorrow is fragile, she thought, but it is ours to shape. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the broken glass before her, a reminder of the delicate balance she must now embody, protector and nurturer, warrior and healer. The world beyond the orphanage's walls remained shadowed by threats, by those who sought to control, to exploit, to destroy. Yet within these walls, a new beginning had taken root. Elara's voice broke the stillness as she spoke to the children, her words carrying the weight of both caution and hope. "We have survived the night. Now we begin again, together." Lumen's glowing heart pulsed softly in response, a beacon in the growing light. Outside, the wind stirred the broken leaves and scattered dust, carrying with it the promise of change. The fragile children, under Elara's vigilant gaze, were no longer mere reflections of innocence. They were the first light of a fragile tomorrow, resilient and alive. And as the sun rose higher, casting long, fractured shadows across the orphanage's shattered halls, Elara stepped forward, ready to face the uncertain road ahead with a heart as fragile and as strong as the glass children she loved. The future was fragile, but it was theirs, and that was enough to hold on to. The morning unfolded with a quiet grace, the air thick with the scent of fresh earth and lingering smoke from the fires that had raged the night before. The children moved slowly, their delicate forms shimmering like living crystal, fragile but unbroken. Elara and Myra worked side by side, tending to minor cracks and ensuring the children's safety. Jax's presence was a steady reassurance, his eyes sharp and watchful as he patrolled the perimeter, wary of any lingering threats. In a small corner of the courtyard, Lumen sat cross-legged, the glow of their heart casting soft ripples of light across the cracked concrete. A gentle breeze stirred their hair as they reached out to touch a cluster of wildflowers that had taken root amidst the ruin. Their fingertips traced the petals with reverence, the moment filled with a silent promise of hope and renewal. Elara approached quietly, kneeling beside Lumen. "You remind me," she said softly, "that even the smallest light can break through the darkest night." Lumen's luminous eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat, the boundary between caretaker and child dissolved. In that shared gaze was a profound understanding, a fragile connection that transcended glass and flesh. As the day wore on, Elara found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The sterile halls, the cold experiments, the shattering betrayals, all led to this fragile moment of new beginnings. She thought of the children as reflections of herself, fragile yet unyielding, mirrors of the soul's capacity to endure. Night approached once more, but this time, Elara faced it with a steadiness born of hard-won hope. She stood watch by the window, eyes sharp and reflective, heart open and guarded. The glass children slept peacefully, their fragile forms aglow with quiet life. And outside, beyond the shattered walls, the world waited, uncertain, fragile, but alive with possibility. Elara whispered into the night, a vow carried on the wind, "I will protect you, all of you, no matter what comes." The fragile tomorrow had dawned, and with it, a promise that even in brokenness, life could shine.